my name's Matthew Wills. I'm a paleontologist, an evolutionary biologist, paleontologist. I study fossils. So why on earth am I giving you a lecture on what aliens look like? I have to fess up right at the beginning and say I don't know. No one's ever seen one. So this is a speculative exploration of some ideas in evolutionary biology, really. The idea that there are some things which we see on Earth which keep evolving. It's a phenomenon called convergent evolution. And what might we learn from convergent evolution? There are other things on Earth that seem to have only happened once and seem to have taken a hugely long time to happen. And we might speculate that those are rather difficult things to evolve, but the things that keep on happening, maybe those are easier. And maybe in the setting of another planet, another ecosystem, extraterrestrial ecosystem, maybe those sorts of things would be likely to evolve as well. So that's where I'm coming from. So this is the Earth. And you probably know that there are a huge number of species on the Earth, something like 10 million or thereabouts. The exact number's a bit moot. But all of those species, all of life, has a common origin. There's one single origin of life, and there's a gigantic, great big tree of life that relates all of the species together. And, of course, so have we got a sample size of 10 million, or have we just got a sample size of one? One origin of life. So we've only, if you study physics, or you study chemistry, or cosmology, you're studying science, laws, if you like, laws of nature, that we presume apply everywhere in the universe. If you study biology, you're only studying life on this one planet, the sample size of 1, n equals 1. So is biology a parochial science? Could it be very different elsewhere? Or maybe there are some clues, some commonalities. This is the tree of life. One of the things I do is try to work out the branching structure of the tree of life using fossils. I'm interested in how major groups of animals are related to one another. So I'm interested in the sort of deep phylogeny, the sort of ancient, very, very deep stuff. So let's start with a question. What is life? Have any of you seen a list something like this before? The characteristics of living things. Is that sort of familiar to anybody? In some sort of form. So living things, they move around, moving around, a bit too much probably. They excrete. I did that before I came in, you'll be glad to know. They reproduce, either sexually or asexually. They respire, take in gases, give out other gases, and that's part of their metabolic process. They're irritable. That just means to say that they respond to stimuli. If I sort of go boo to my cat, it looks at me in a very concerned manner. Nutrition. Probably my cat's come to see me because it wants something to eat. And we grow. Living things grow. So all living things seem to share those attributes. But what about this flame then? So it's moving. It's excreting. It's leaving behind burnt wood. It's eating the wood, if you like, consuming the wood. We could hand round candles and light them. Probably health and safety wouldn't let us, but we could reproduce the flame. If you blow it or wave your hand at it, it responds to stimuli. It's irritable. Nutrition, we've said, and grow. You can set fire to things. So why, if all of those things that we can list for living things also apply to the flame, and I think we'll happily say that's not living, what's the difference? What is it about life? Well, how are we going to nail this down? Anybody want to? Yes, sir. What's that? Evolve. Yeah, okay, and I think that's the key. To evolve, of course, you need to pass on, really, it's propagating information. In order to evolve, the information in the system has to change. Flames are always flames. There's no information within them. So that's the key thing. There's information in life. We propagate information. your genome, I looked it up this morning, something like, in terms of information content, something like about 3/4 of a gigabyte. That's all. It's quite astonishingly small, really. So we could probably fit all of our genomes on a phone quite happily. But of course, passing on information, that's the key to evolution and also to life. So what's life made of on the Earth? Well, we're all carbon-based. Since this is the only sort of life we know about, people have thought in terms of carbon-based life elsewhere in the universe. Of course, there could be forms of life, uncorporeal, disembodied forms of life that we can't begin to imagine, but we've got to stick with the rules of life as we understand them. And people have thought about different chemistries. So carbon is great because it forms these 4 bonds. It can form double bonds, and it can form complex linked chains of molecules, like DNA, which is great for encoding information in the repeating structure of the chain. It can also form very stable bonds with other atoms like phosphorus, sulfur, of course, oxygen and hydrogen. And those seem to be stable over a wide variety of temperatures and pressures, at least as we experience on the Earth. People have wondered about alternative chemistries. People have wondered about silicon as an alternative. There's rather less silicon than there is... I think that's wrong. There's more silicon than carbon. But the chemistry of silicon is not so good. Water solubility and so forth, and the stability of the bonds and the variety of the bonds. So this is from the original Star Trek. This is back in the 60s. They encountered this silicon-based life form, and the special effects department at the time just produced this big mound of rubber, basically, rather nondescript looking thing. And people have speculated, you can read into this if you like, on other exotic extraterrestrial biochemistries. But I'm told by the chemists that carbon really is your best bet. And there we are. We all know about sort of basic carbon chemistry. And there's the original Spock, Mr. Spock, mind melding with a silicon life form. So I can give you a cop-out answer to my question at the beginning, what do aliens look like? And that's to look around you. So I'm sure many of you know that the heavy atoms, carbon and so forth, are manufactured within stars as they get older. So stars are gigantic nuclear fusion reactors building heavier nuclei. So how did they get from the interior of a star, how did the carbon in your body get from there into you? Well, some of it is just sort of vaporized, if you like, away into space by solar winds, away from stars. But more spectacularly, many stars, as they get older, they go through little coughs and they eject layers of material into space, and some of them blow themselves to pieces in supernovae. They blow this material, these heavier atoms, into space and into deep space, and this material eventually recoalesces to form new stars. So new stars are made out of old ones. And when those planetary systems form around the stars, and when the Earth formed around our sun, there was carbon from previous solar systems, previous suns, previous stars on the Earth, and went to make up our biochemistry. So we are all from outer space, if you like. The atoms in your body, the heavy atoms, have all come from the interiors of suns, previous suns, millions and millions, billions of years ago. And that really is astonishing. So there we are. That's just many stars are a bit like onions made up of layers, and different reactions go on at different layers. But basically, pushing together heavier and heavier atoms. So how did life first evolve on the Earth? Well, we know the Earth is something in the region of 4.5 billion years old, 4,500 million years old, something of that region. And I said there were some things that seem to happen very easily and very quickly in terms of evolution, and some things that seem to have taken an enormously long time. Well, life is surprisingly early on the scene. There's a period in the Earth's history where everything was molten, incredibly hot, and lots of material was raining down onto the surface. We were being bombarded. It's called the Late Heavy Bombardment. And more or less right at the end of that period, as soon as things have cooled down a little bit, we find the first biochemical evidence for life. So life is very, very early on the scene, and if the history of the Earth is anything to go by, life itself seems to be quite relatively easy, I guess, or we've been very, very, very lucky, one or the other. And of course, we're here thinking about this problem because we're on a planet where intelligent life has evolved, so it's self-selecting in a way. There may be loads and loads of other planets where this didn't happen. Probably the majority, and that's why they're not thinking about it. Anyway, back in the 1950s, people thought, well, if we take the gases that we think were present in the early atmosphere, outgassing from volcanic vents and so forth, making an early atmosphere, Earth being big enough to retain that atmosphere, the Moon not, for example. If we take those gases and we add a little bit of water, no oxygen in here, by the way. Oxygen, no good. Must keep oxygen out. And you put some energy through a spark or ultraviolet radiation, and you just let this go. Can we make life? Will it spontaneously generate? The answer is no, or at least nobody's been able to do it in a lab setting. But what you do make are very complex biomolecules. So things like amino acids, nucleotides, sugars and so forth, will self-assemble. The problem is the yield is desperately low. So most of what you make is just brown, gunky, tarry stuff. But there is a small amount of a very low yield of complex biomolecules. But of course, that's not life, and they don't contain information. So perhaps the best idea, the best theory we have, stood up to challenge reasonably well for about the last 40 years or so, is something called the RNA world hypothesis. Now, of course, you know that the information within your genome is encoded by DNA. You also know that RNA does the job of making copies and running it out into the cell to be expressed into a protein. The RNA world hypothesis gets around a particular chicken and egg problem we have with looking at how living cells work. And that's the fact that in order to copy DNA, we need enzymes, we need proteins, and in order to make proteins, we need to express the DNA to make the protein. So which comes first? Without one, you can't have the other. The RNA world hypothesis recognizes that there are certain RNA molecules called ribozymes that can not only store information, they can also catalyze reactions on themselves. They can make copies of themselves. So the idea is that early on in the evolution of, before there was cellular life, there were complex molecules that were able to make copies of themselves. Some of those would have been able to make copies better, more faithfully, quicker, grab hold of building blocks in the environment and do that more efficiently. So the RNA world hypothesis is the best hypothesis we have. So when did life first evolve? I've already told you that. So this is the late heavy bombardment, or rather an artist's impression of what it might have. Notice the moon is much closer, and the moon's gradually moved away. One of the weird things about the moon, if you've ever thought about it, is we only ever see the same face of it. So actually the moon goes around us in the same time it takes the moon to orbit on its axis. So you only ever see one side. Weird, isn't it? Anyway, there we are. So this is the formation of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. That's the late heavy bombardment. And here we are, the first life, right at the end of this period of time called the Hadean. Hades being the Greek underworld. So first evidence of life here, photosynthesis. Round about 3 billion years ago or thereabouts. And as far as we know, photosynthesis has only evolved once. Okay, so there are lots of organisms that have taken photosynthetic prokaryotes, effectively, things like cyanobacteria, and they've incorporated them into their own structures. So plants have chloroplasts, and those chloroplasts ancestrally were once free-living, something like cyanobacteria, photosynthetic. Lots of protists have engulfed other protists in these endosymbiotic events. So photosynthesis had a huge impact on the Earth. It started to produce oxygen. The atmosphere would change over time. It would be oxygenated. That oxygen cuts out a lot of the very ionizing radiation that's raining down on us from the sun. So we're cutting out UV. And we may be cutting out the very thing which enabled the origin of life in the first place. So it's a sort of one-way ticket, if you like. Once you've evolved life, you may well be incapable of evolving it again. And there's a cyanobacterium. That's a blue-green alga, something like the first photosynthetic organism. And we've got evidence of these things from the fossil record as well. Now, there's a completely off-the-wall idea as to where life came from, and it comes from a reputable source. Francis Crick, together with James Watson, who discovered the structure of DNA. And I don't think they necessarily took this, or Francis Crick necessarily took this entirely seriously, but he said, well, it's a possibility. It's an idea called directed panspermia. Much recycled idea in lots of science fiction. The idea is that maybe life came from elsewhere in the universe. One idea is that life is so fantastically improbable that maybe it's been seeded from one system, one planet to the next, one solar system to the next, possibly, maybe, in some form. Directed panspermia says there's some intelligent civilization behind the process. So there's a film called Prometheus, I wouldn't necessarily recommend, by Ridley Scott. It's a forerunner of the Alien film. And the conceit in this film is that there are these beings called the engineers who are seeding life around. And Francis Crick thought maybe that's... But of course, this is just the ultimate kicking the can up the road solution. It doesn't really explain where life came from. It just says, well, it didn't happen here, so let's not worry about it in a way. So what were the first animals like? Let's ask that question on Earth. Anybody heard of the Cambrian explosion? The Cambrian is a set of rocks from about 500 million years ago, 500 million years ago. And the type sections are in Wales, hence Cambrian. And those rocks preserve, in some parts of the world, they preserve the first really complex animal fossils. And they appear in the fossil record in something of a fanfare. There's not a lot we see in the Precambrian. There are some soft, squidgy organisms called the Ediacaran fauna, but these don't have any recognizable characteristics. They don't have a gut, they don't have any sense organs, they don't have much by way of internal structure as far as we can tell. And then suddenly in the Cambrian we have the evolution of hard parts. So things like teeth and shells and maybe simple bones and so forth. And we also have the evolution of sense organs. For the first time, animals can see. For the first time, they've got jaws. For the first time, they've got armor. They can move around. They can evade things. They can be predators. The whole of all the things we take for granted in modern ecosystems, suddenly they're there in the Cambrian. So there's this explosion of diversity. So bear in mind then, we've had simple life very early on, and then, well, virtually nothing complicated. We've had the origin of eukaryotic cells somewhere along the line, but the business of sticking cells together to make complex animals just takes, where are we now? Probably about 3 billion years or something like that. I mean, if you were monitoring the Earth, if you were an alien civilization monitoring the Earth over eons of time, and you watched the origin of life on Earth, and you watched simple cells evolve, you saw the atmosphere oxygenate, and that was it, and you were waiting, and billions of years go by. You'd say, well, I don't think we'll call this one. Shall we go and look at somewhere else? But no, suddenly, 500 million years ago, a little bit longer, bang, this explosion of animal diversity. So what are the simplest animals like today? Well, you can imagine you might stick a few cells together. This is embryological change. You stick a few cells together, you hollow it out. I'm sure many of you have come across this. So you've got a hollow ball, and you stick a little tuck underneath it and make an invagination. Stick some tentacles on the bottom of that, and you've more or less got, if I can make this work, one of those. So jellyfishes today, sea anemones, they're built up of just 2 layers of cells, and these organisms are amazingly similar to many fossils we find from the Cambrian. They really haven't changed a great deal. So it's the simplest sort of body construction you can imagine. There's no head, there's no left and right side. They have what's called radial symmetry. So you can sort of imagine sticking them on a spike. I'm not proposing anyone does this. Turning them round, and they look the same from any angle, more or less. So in the Cambrian, then, we go from radially symmetrical animals, really, to bilaterally symmetrical animals for the first time. We've got things that have a front end, a back end, a left and a right side, and a ventral and a dorsal surface. So there are these 4 axes, if you like, that make up our bodies. And more or less all animals now have a bilaterally symmetrical body. So this is one thing that once you've done it, once you've become bilaterally symmetrical, you probably don't go back. So just to recap then, what do I think? I think that it's quite possible that life on other planets has got stuck at the single cell stage, or very simple. I think complex life, we have to wait a very long time to see it appear on Earth, and it's possible that complex organisms are very rare on other planets. Whereas bacteria, prokaryotes, single-celled organisms might be much more common. And the sorts of probes that we've sent to the other planets are looking, by and large, for biomarkers, chemical signals of life, and for evidence of simple life. We're not expecting something to wander up to the camera and go, hello. We think that's unlikely. One of the big puzzles for Darwin, and he writes On the Origin, the case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views herein entertained. That's in The Origin of Species. The Cambrian radiation, the Cambrian explosion, was a real puzzle to Darwin. It's widely misinterpreted by people who take a particular type of creationist view. If we look at the appearance of this is a very simplified diagram, but these are the major groups of animals. They all seem to appear simultaneously. Okay, that's jellyfishes down a little bit below. But this sudden sort of everything appearing at once thing is really quite perplexing. There's a whole series of lectures on that if you're interested in the final year. So, do I think aliens will have heads? Let's do a bit of kind of speculating now. So, I think it's quite likely. I think bilateral symmetry seems to be, if we find complex aliens, if we find aliens that are intelligent. Now, let's slightly change the question. I think they're likely to be bilaterally symmetrical. I think they're likely to have a head, because I think when you become bilaterally symmetrical, you tend to evolve along with that a gut that goes through the animal. So instead of, as in jellyfish, there's just one way in and one way out, in bilaterally symmetrical animals, there tends to be a gut that goes all the way through, not in all, but in most. And that means you encounter the world in a particular direction. And if you're going to eat something, as you're trundling along, it goes in one end, and what's left comes out the other end. And splendid that is too. But that also means that you can put all your sense organs at one end, because you're encountering the world in that order. So your eyes, when they evolve, taste, so on, senses of hearing and so forth, tend to be facing forward, the direction in which things come at you from. And, of course, if you've got a ventral surface, if you're moving over a hard substrate, if you're walking along on something, then you tend to put whatever you're doing to walk along with, be it a muscular venter or legs or some other mechanism, you tend to put those on the ventral surface. All these sense organs at the front, you're also going to tend to want to put your nervous processing equipment, your brain as it might become, at the front end as well. You become, in other words, increasingly cephalized. And if you're going to be an intelligent alien, you probably need a bit of processing power. So you probably need quite a large brain, and that's likely to give you something you might recognize as a head, a thing stuck on the front of the animal. So jellyfishes, remember, don't have anything we could say is a head, whereas most animals have bilateral symmetry, cephalization to some degree. So how many eyes are we going to go for? Well, what about one eye? That looks weird. There's lots of things, lots of monsters and aliens that have been designed with a single eye. So an eye capable of forming a complex image has lots of components in it. There are lots of very simple eyes within animals, but if you're going to have an eye that's complex enough to form an image that one can interpret some detail about the world, why not have two of them? Because all of the genes and all of the developmental processes that go into one eye can be duplicated if you're bilaterally symmetrical. Most things we have in pairs. And we're symmetrical over most of our body. Apart from internally, we've got a bit of asymmetry going on. But it's less critical because your internal bits and pieces aren't interacting in a direct and not interfacing directly with the internal environment. External environment, sorry. The other great advantage of having two eyes, well, there's two of them really. One is you can have them looking in slightly different directions, so you've got a wider field of view. But of course, critically, you can have binocular vision. You can judge distance. Brilliant if you're a predator. You can see where things are. Great if you're a thing being predated on. You can got a wider field of view and you can judge what's coming at you. But many eyes, what about having lots and lots of eyes? Well, actually, so one eye, I think, is less likely. Lots of eyes, I think, is much more probable. You can have eyes that respond to different wavelengths. You can have eyes that do slightly different jobs, something that responds better to movement. Compound eyes of insects are brilliant at detecting movement. Much, much better, much quicker. Their response time is vastly quicker than ours. You see something moving quickly, really, it's just a blur. We can't really differentiate, through time very well. Insects, brilliant at it. But we've got much higher visual acuity. If something stays still, you can see it much more clearly. This is the head of a wasp or a hornet, and you can see the two big compound eyes. You can also see three little eyes on the top of the head called ocelli. These do a rather different job than the compound eyes. So 5 eyes. Actually, insects have got 5 eyes. Most of them have. This is a spider. And instead of having compound eyes, it's got eyes that have a big lens in the front, so much more like ours in many respects. And it's got lots of them, looking in different directions. This is a jumping spider, a member of the Salticidae. So it needs to be able to judge how far it's got to jump, where it's going. And they're also predatory and rather beautiful. Many of them are rather amazing colours. But there we are. So lots of eyes seems quite likely. Did you know... I bet you didn't. You do now, though. But did you know that clams, so bivalve mollusks, like scallops and so forth, many of them have eyes around the edge of the mantle? They're not very good, but they don't need to be, do they? All this thing needs to know is something going to come and try and eat it and prise its shell open? If so, shut the shell. That's it. So they really just sense a shadow falling over the animal, and it can tell how big the shadow is, maybe roughly where it's coming from, and it can close its shell. This is a box jellyfish, right? Box jellyfish have eyes, have camera eyes, a bit like ours. They're in these structures called rhopalia, and it's got one at the base of each of these 4 big tentacles that hang down below the animal. It's got one major one, and it's got these little ones as well. Now, jellyfish are amazing because they have this diffuse nervous system. They don't have a sort of concentrated brain in the same way that we do. So we don't really understand how they process this information. There's a whole research agenda there. But they're very fast movers, very fast swimmers, and predatory. So they presumably are using these eyes to see their prey. In something as simple as a jellyfish. Amazing. This is the head of a lizard. I think this is the common lizard, Lacerta vivipara. And there's this little thing on the top of its head. That's not a sort of wart or something. That's a thinning of the skull called the parietal eye. And they're able to use the parietal eye to detect infrared radiation in particular, much better than their main eye. So they use this to decide where to bask. If you're a lizard, you need to warm up. You need to get in the sunlight. And they use this to optimize their position. Really rather clever. So even in vertebrates, there are different, if you like, different types of radiation detectors, which after all is what eyes really are. If we go back to the Cambrian again, there's this lovely animal called Opabinia. And it's a real fossil. This, of course, is an artist's impression of the thing. There are lots of fossils of this thing, so we know it's not some sort of aberration of preservation. It really does have 5 eyes, 5 big, complex eyes. They don't seem to be much different. They seem to be possibly compound. It's got its mouth at the end of this sort of Hoover pipe thing at the end. And it's got a body that has these sort of imbricating flaps. And a mouth, actually, that's a bit like a camera shutter. Amazing animal. But yes, so early on in the history of animals, groups were exploring what they could do with eyes. Eyes, again, so I said there are some things that have evolved lots and lots of times, and that we might think that aliens, complex, intelligent aliens, might have them. Eyes have evolved, complex eyes have evolved something like 30 times. So they're very, very common. Of course, if you're going to form an image of light and make an image, there's only many ways you can do it. You know, you need a sort of receptive layer of cells. You need something, presumably, to not just let light in from everywhere, but to constrain it. So either a sort of hole, like a pinhole camera, or you can put a lens in front and that improves the thing no end. So you either go that way, or you go for some sort of compound structure where you've got lots of, like looking through loads of straws, and you pull in the light from different directions and make a compound image. But again and again, eyes keep evolving, because there's only so many ways to do it, given the physics. Similar thing with teeth and jaws. This is from the, I think it was 1998 remake of King Kong, I think, possibly. No, it's a bit later than that, I think, wasn't it? This is, these are obviously CGI, but there are worms called prearpulid worms that they get to about yay big, and they have these jaws like that. So these are giant prearpulid worms that eat some of the crew. But so teeth basically are structures, and jaws are structures at the front of the animal that grab hold of prey, grab hold of things they want to eat. And those evolve again and again and again throughout the animal kingdom. Convergent evolution. So I think jaws are likely. Eyes are likely to have 2 or more eyes. You're likely to put these structures in a head of some sort. What sort of skeleton are we going to go for? Well, if we look on Earth, there's basically 3 options. You either have a hydrostatic skeleton, like a jellyfish. You have fluid, or an earthworm, fluid-filled bags, and you work your muscles against that. So muscles can only contract. They can only squeeze and make things longer and thinner. They can work against levers and so on. So a hydrostatic skeleton's one idea. You have levers inside, and you support yourself with bones inside, or you have the skeleton on the outside, like a suit of armour. Now, there's a large clade of organisms called the Ecdysozoa, the molting animals, and that includes spiders and scorpions and crabs and so on, the arthropods. The Ecdysozoa have sort of painted themselves into an evolutionary corner. When they get bigger, they have to get rid of the whole of the hard part of the outer skeleton and sort of inflate themselves and make another one. And then they do it again, and they grow in steps. And they don't seem to get around that. We're able to remodel our skeleton. If you go up in space, your skeleton, you start to lose minerals from your skeleton. If you put particular stresses on your skeleton, particular bones in a particular way, it will strengthen it. It will remodel it. And as we grow from children up to adults, we ossify more of it, and we can just gradually, incrementally, beautifully, smoothly grow our skeleton. So ours just grows in a lovely curve, a lovely smooth curve. Insects go, and when they do, they're all soft and floppy. And they've got nothing to support themselves. So the biggest arthropods evolve in water, where there's something to support them. When they ecdyse, they can just float around or crawl under rock and float around, and they're protected for long enough to produce the new exoskeleton. So one of the most common things you'll see in science fiction is some sort of arthropod-like alien. So arthropods, as they are on the Earth, can't get very big because of this collapsing under your own weight problem, because they can't remodel the exoskeleton. It's a dead structure, whereas our bones are very much alive. So, yes, you could have something with an exoskeleton, but it would have to be doing that exoskeleton in a different way physiologically from the way that arthropods on the Earth do them. So that's a giant Japanese spider crab, and that's about as big as you get as an arthropod. These are some very large insects held by some very creepy-looking kids, and that's about as big as you get as a terrestrial arthropod. That's my favourite one, that one, the giant spiny stick insect. The weta in New Zealand's another rather splendid thing. So arthropods like this is from Starship Troopers, which again I wouldn't necessarily recommend. Very unlikely, unless they're making their exoskeleton work in a different way. There's one from Doctor Who, that's from the David Tennant era, basically a giant spider. This is a marvellous film called District 9. It's a Swiftian satire. It's not really science fiction at all. It's by Neil Blomkamp, I think. And this is basically a giant locust, really, or giant insect, the alien in this. So how will aliens move about them? So vertebrates then were using levers, work against some sort of lever, have a limb that sticks out and have levers. Arthropods do the same sort of thing. Instead of having the muscles join the levers on the outside, of course their limbs are tubes and you have the muscles on the inside. Notice that those ducks were running quite fast, yes? Notice that we can let you see some of these in the lab. We've got, we keep some of them. This is a giant millipede, and it's got lots of legs. Same sort of biomechanical principle, but do you notice how it moves? It's got two pairs of legs on each segment, and the legs all move in this rhythmic way. So there's a wave of sort of contraction goes down the animal. You can sort of see this rhythm. So it can only really walk in one way. And having lots of legs constrains you like that. It can't really change gear. It's great for bulldozing its way along, If you ever tried to pick one off of your hand, or you'll find it takes a bit of doing. They can really hold on. But think of something like a horse with 4 legs, or even you. Horses can run, canter, gallop, trot. They can change gear. They can change the way they move in order to move more efficiently at different speeds. So can you. You can run, you can walk, you can, not quite as impressively as a horse, I grant you, but you can change gear. So if you're going to move around at any speed, I would say lots of legs are unlikely. So if this is a fast-moving alien, I reckon, and of course 4 limbs gives you stability. It's 1 on each corner. It's like a table. 2 it will free up a pair of limbs to do other things with. Birds fly with theirs. We write computer code with ours. But yes, so 4 limbs and moving to bipedality to free up dexterity and so forth. Maybe that's quite likely. There are other ways of moving around. This snail has this muscular foot. You can see these waves of contraction. It doesn't move very fast, though, does it? I mean, let's be honest. Suits the snail fine. And it also needs to move on a layer of slime, which is not good in polite company, you know. Oh, and this, do you know what this is? Starfish, thank you, brilliant. Tube feet. So these are little hydraulic suckers with muscles, and the whole thing is all amazing. They're coordinated. So starfish sort of glide along on all these little limbs. Again, not very fast, but brilliant for prizing things open. So convergent evolution. I don't think that's possibly telling me a lie, and it's a little bit later than it is. Hi. Yeah, we're all right for 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes. So convergent evolution, then, it's this phenomenon whereby remarkably similar structures keep evolving on the tree of life. This is the top left is the eye of a fish. The bottom right is the eye of a squid. Okay, this is possibly one of the most famous examples. Fish is, of course, a vertebrate, more closely related to you. Squid are mollusks, more closely related to the snail we've just been looking at. So if we put these onto a sort of back of an envelope tree of major groups of animals, you can see that squid are up there and the fish is down there. And these groups have diverged something like, we think they diverged in the Precambrian, in fact. So probably about, give or take, 800 million years ago. So 800 million years on both branches. That's 1.6 billion years of independent evolution. And they go and come up with more or less the same sort of eye. I can tell you a bit more about the detail of that. But that's convergent evolution. In mammals, okay, you know about placental mammals and marsupials. Marsupials give birth to tiny young and they put them in a pouch, things like kangaroos. Placentals they gestate for longer, they have bigger young when they give birth. So those two groups of mammals diverged back in the time of the dinosaurs, back in the Cretaceous, probably back further still into the Jurassic. Okay, so they were at that time very simple mammals, maybe a bit rodent-like perhaps, fairly small and nondescript. On different continents they were radiating and diverging. But the amazing thing is, over time, both the placentals and the marsupials have come up with similar-looking forms. So this is a list of, there's a marsupial and a placental mole, anteater, mouse, something a bit like a primate, flying squirrel, and the Tasmanian wolf. Okay, this is the skull of a dog. This is the marsupial version of the same thing, the thylacine wolf. Probably went extinct in the 1930s. The last one we know of was in captivity in Hobart Zoo, and it died in 1936. And just to sort of blow your mind, for those of you who dislike zoos, it died because it got locked out of the zoo by accident. But the similarity in the teeth, in the skull, in the foot, the way the bones form this morphology, just absolutely astonishing. And okay, the rest of the animal doesn't look quite so convincingly like a dog, but that's not bad, is it? That's not a bad approximation of a dog in a completely different lineage of mammals. The same with saber-toothed tigers. There's a marsupial version of the saber-toothed tiger and a placental one. Moles, right? Moles have evolved at least 4 times. This is the mole, the European mole, and this is closely related to, let's say, a hedgehog. That's the golden mole. That's more closely related to an elephant. Yeah, no, honestly, really it is. This is the marsupial mole. So that's more closely related to kangaroo. And this is a naked mole rat, so it's a rodent. Convergent evolution keeps getting you. Oh, never mind mole crickets. We won't go there. But I mean, look at the forelimbs. Look, exactly the same sort of look to the forelimbs because they're doing the same biomechanical job. Okay. Do you know this thing top left is a woodlouse? So that's a crustacean, relative of crabs. This thing on the bottom is a very short millipede. But again, convergent evolution, these things on the left, they both eat decaying wood and they live in similar habitats. But they've 2 groups of arthropods, I grant you, but they've arrived at the same sort of solution. Okay, so I'm going to cut to the chase now. I'm going to finish off. So what will aliens look like? I've suggested that they may, in many respects, look quite familiar, intelligent aliens. I think they'd have something you might recognize as some sort of face. I'm not saying you could read their expression, but I think they'd probably have eyes, they'd have a mouth. I think they may well have 4 limbs. Of course, back in the sort of 40s and 50s and 60s, if you wanted to make a science fiction film, you had to persuade someone to clamber into a rubber suit and look threatening. And so a lot of aliens in the kind of early science fiction stuff used to look rather humanoid. This chap on the right is William Shatner, who next Tuesday, by the way, is going up in Jeff Bezos's giant, I don't know what it is really, giant rocket apparently. Looks a bit rude to me. And of course, in science fiction, for a long time, people were constrained by doing a similar sort of thing. This was the first Alien film. This was a chap was pushing on for 7 feet tall that climbed in the rubber suit for the first Alien movie. But in Doctor Who as well, Zygons, people in rubber suits. Predator looks a bit boss-eyed. Now, of course, with CGI, we can do anything we like, and quite convincingly. But again, probably in order that you can empathize with the character, they look remarkably humanoid and remarkably like us. And of course, the Doctor is exactly like us. Right, I think I'm going to. I think it is 5 past now, isn't it, or more or less? So I think I should call a halt, and I will post up. I'll post up this lecture and the slides if anybody wants them on Moodle. Okay, thank you very much. Take care.